Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 26th video discussing 1950s British science fiction paperbacks. For this video, I thought I'd respond to some of my recent correspondents who've been remarking how they enjoyed seeing very rare books that they hadn't been able to find. So let's take a look at a very rare paperback indeed. Strictly speaking, Worlds of the Universe was published as a magazine, but since it was issued in the standard paperback format, or pocketbook as they were known in the 50s, it belongs in any collection of 1950s British science fiction paperbacks. A judgment reinforced by the fact that there was only one issue published in November 1953. Let's have a look at the contents page. There we see the contents page, just 3 stories. No editor was credited, but I've always assumed that it was artist Norman Light, who was presumably the publisher, who was given his Gold Light Publishing Company. This was further suggested by the fact that the cover and all of the interior illustrations were very obviously the work of Norman Light, even though they were signed Marcus. Let's just see the illustrations. See, signed Marcus, but obviously the work of Norman Light. There we see full page Norman Light. Illustration. We'll come back to that ridiculous bear creature in the video. There's the last illustration, probably the best illustration. Well, usually for Light, he was a comic strip artist, but he did a bit of finer shading and cross-hatching in that illustration. But most of his artwork, as we've seen, is distinctly a comic book. Right, so that's the Light Illo was mentioned. Gold Light was the same publisher who was concurrently publishing the comic book titled Spaceman, mainly drawn by Norman Light and featuring his lead character Captain Future. This comic was quite successful, running to around 15 issues, 1953 through 54, and living on in various reprints and adaptations for many years afterwards. The success of his comic book evidently inspired Light to try his hand at editing and publishing a science fiction magazine. But his bold, linear comic book style of illustration only served to brand it as a juvenile magazine, which proved to be a commercial kiss of death. This impression would have been sadly confirmed by anyone reading 2 of its 3 stories. Lilliput Minor by Thomas W. Wade and Spawn of the Void, also written by Wade under the pseudonym of John Silvacy. Misspelled on the cover is Silvacy without the E, and the mistake was compounded by crediting the Lilliput Minor story to having been written by a Manning Stern. And completing the hat trick of mistakes, the author of the 3rd story, Mark Denham, was misspelled on the cover as Morse, with a C instead of a K. Now, Spawn of the Void was illustrated on the cover in the attractive comic book style here by Norman Light. But if you look at the man waving his arms, you'll see something quite significant. Get this book out. There you see, man waving his arms. Spawn of the Void was illustrated, but obviously the cover was pretty much of a swipe from the August 1950 issue of this cover by Robert Gibson Jones from the US magazine Amazing Stories. So evidently Norman Light was a keen follower of American science fiction magazine art, and obviously took his inspiration from the magazines in America. Now, what of the story itself? Let's just turn to that story. The cover story we'll discuss first, Spawn of the Void, page 69. Spawn of the Void, page 69. Let's just have a look at this dreadful story. I struggle to express my opinion of this story without descending to obscenity. This story was truly awful. A disgrace, appallingly written with long convoluted sentences, awkward grammar, and stilted wording. It was juvenile and fatuous, absurd. It involves a spaceship from Earth setting out to explore Titan, the largest moon of Saturn. They find the satellite to have a breathable atmosphere with a warm, temperate climate, covered in forests and dotted with architecturally beautiful cities. But the ship is shot down by a hostile alien spacecraft, as we see on the cover. And soon they're captured by the bear, the giant bear men, covered in silver fur, carrying ray guns and wearing natty green trunks, God help us. If you can force yourself to read the story, you will learn that the bear men are invaders from Neptune, and that the true inhabitants are a race of beautiful, friendly, 4-foot-high bird men and bird women. The less said about this crime against science fiction, the better. Now let's have a look at the other story by Wade, Lilliput Minor. There we are, Lilliput Minor by Thomas W. Wade. This is a ridiculous fairy tale, utterly absurd. After learning that his girlfriend is only associating with him because of his money, an unhappy man travels to Africa to forget, as you do. And one day when he's walking through the jungle, he's attacked and chased up a tree by the lion. There he is, up the tree. He eventually goes to sleep in the bough of the tree, and then feeling hungry when he wakes up the next morning, he's moved to eat some peculiar berries he finds growing on the tree, whereupon he promptly begins to shrink. Slipping out of his now oversized clothing, he continues to shrink and shrink and shrink. He drops down from the tree and flounders around as he gets ever smaller. His actual size is never described, but eventually he is presumably microscopic. He ends up in a Lilliputian land and thoughtfully fashions himself a grass loincloth to cover his tiny todger. The story is a ludicrous fantasy where our hero rescues a beautiful white girl dressed in a red velvet gown who is being attacked by a dark-skinned ape man. The grateful girl takes him to her village where the buildings are beautiful and fitted with bathrooms and all modern appliances. He's taken in by her parents and learns to speak her language in just a couple of weeks. He also learns that her name is Roanna, and her race, the Rutans, are highly civilized and apparently have atomic handguns. After he's married to Roanna, they are attacked by the ape men, one of whom gives him an injection. He promptly grows back to his normal size, Alice in Wonderland style. And when he's found wandering naked in the jungle and tells his fantastic story, he is unsurprisingly promptly placed in a hospital for the mentally afflicted. Several decades later, he tells his story to our narrator, Mr. Wade, a bleak Stern, who writes it all down in his little notebook and now presents it to us, ending, "I believe him to this day." Now, there's only one thing more unbelievable than this story. That is that it should ever have been published at all. All concerned should be thoroughly ashamed. We should not be surprised to learn that all of Mr. Wade's 23 other wretched magazine stories and 4 novels were published by John Spencer and Company Limited. Here we see the products of John Spencer. All by Mr. Wade. Don't be fooled by the attractive Gordon Davies and Norman Light covers. These stories are all crap. Astonishing as it is, Wade later managed to get another 4 novels published in 1962-63 by another not-so-fussy publisher, Digit Books. Why then should this wretched magazine have pride of place in my collection? Well, as a few of you have probably guessed, the 3rd story in the magazine, the lead novelette, Waters of Eternity, was actually written by John Russell Fern under his personal pseudonym of Mark Denham. Now, this byline had been used only once before in 1946 for a story entitled Solar Assignment in the first issue of New Worlds. And here we see that issue of New Worlds. The first issue was published with this dreadful cover by Bob Wilkin initially, and the magazine contained 4 short stories, including the Mark Denham story, and all 4 stories were by John Russell Fern under various names. But this dreadful cover caused the magazine to be a disaster sales-wise, and the publisher called in all the unsold thousands of copies, and he replaced them with a space cover, with a second cover. And because it was a spaceship cover, and this was a spaceship story, it was billed as illustrating Solar Assignment. And here's the story. And if anybody remembers my last video, you'll recall that I conjectured that this story, set on Pluto, might well have inspired E.C. Tubb to write his 1954 novel, Alien Life. Okay. When I discovered this obscure magazine in 1973, after seeing it listed in a catalogue by the legendary bookseller, the late and greatly missed Ken Chapman, I was baffled at finding Fern in a 1953 British science fiction magazine, because I knew that Fern had been signed up to a 5-year contract in 1950 to write science fiction exclusively for Sky Unlimited. So I read the story avidly to see if it was indeed by Fern, and discovered that it was. I thoroughly enjoyed the story, which was chock full of Fern's favourite science fiction tropes: the strange effect of heavy water on plant and animal life. Heavy water being water in which the oxygen and hydrogen has been broken down by electrical bombardment and, quote, and left an isotope with more electrons than normal water. But the real clinchers were an alien life form consisting of living mathematics and the destruction of a planet that eventually became the asteroids. But then, as I've mentioned in my books and earlier videos, I later learned that Fern had dissolved his contract in September 1952 after Skyen had defaulted on his payments. He'd then been a free agent right through to May 1953 before he signed a revised version of his contract after his debts had been settled, and he would thereafter resume writing science fiction exclusively for Skyen, but he could write other forms of fiction for anybody. Clearly, therefore, Norman Light had approached Fern in his freelance period, and Fern had sold him this story. But why had the story been under the Mark Denham pseudonym that Fern had not used since it had appeared in New Worlds in 1946? The answer to that is that the story was not a new one, but rather an old, unsold manuscript that he'd submitted to John Cornell in 1946. Cornell has recorded that Fern responded to my urgent request for material by sending over 250,000 words. Although Cornell accepted and published no less than 6 stories by Fern, clearly Waters of Eternity had been amongst the unused stories. So Fern had it in his bottom drawer and was able to sell it to Norman Light for his new magazine, Worlds of the Universe. Light must have been even more delighted given the appalling standard of the other stories he had on hand. As he wrote in his editorial, "Here is a story that impressed me a great deal with its style and genuine science fiction outlook. We hope to print more stories by this rising young author in our later publications." Actually, the story was hastily written and unpolished. It was probably a first draft that Fern had hastily dispatched to Cornell to meet his tight submissions deadline. However, it did have an exciting plot, was fast-moving, and was full of a sense of wonder. Perfectly good story. And no doubt Fern would have been happy to unload his many remaining unsold manuscripts, but it was not to be. Light's magazine was cancelled after its first issue. Fortunately for all fans of Fern, all of his unused short stories would very shortly thereafter be sold to Skyen. And for the new Vargo Staten science fiction magazine, published by Skyen, beginning in January 1954. And all of Fern's unsold stories from John Cornell and from the American magazines would appear in this magazine. All of the Fern stories in this magazine were older manuscripts or reprints. That's a Ron Turner cover, by the way, which has been reprinted recently in a new book on science fiction art. So, the Fern story alone makes this paperback collectible. But such is the incredible rarity of this magazine that I suspect that very few people today possess a copy. Well, in concluding this video, I bring you good news and bad news. The bad news is that those of you watching this video and congratulating yourself that you possess a rarity, if you have a copy of this magazine, very likely do not have the real rarity, the true first edition of Worlds of the Universe. For you see, there were 2 separate editions. 2 separate editions. Here you see the second copy, the second printing, where in the editorial reads, "In pride of place, we feature in pride of place is the feature novelette Waters of Eternity by a very promising young author, Mark Denham. But the real first edition is this one. This is the first edition. Because the editor made a mistake in the story's title, and here you can see he called it Waters of Electricity. there. Waters of Eternity and Waters of Electricity. The editor spotted his error, stopped the presses, and corrected the title with new typesetting and resumed printing. But in the last 50 years, I've never ever seen another copy of this edition. So I suspect that very, very few copies of the first printing were made, and hardly any of the second printing copies have survived. But the good news is that I've had Fern's story, Waters of Eternity, reprinted, and it is today readily available from Amazon as the title story of one of several new Fern collections published by Endeavour Press, now Loon Books. Here we see the new book, Waters of Eternity, the lead story. Incidentally, I dedicated this book to my grandson, author Philip King. He hasn't read the book yet. He's still stuck on Star Wars, but he'll get around to it eventually. And if we look at the back cover here, which contains a very enthusiastic blurb written by the publisher, not by me, although I do have an introduction inside the book, we can see here that the book also contains two further classic novelettes, World Without Women, which was originally published in Amazing Stories in 1939, and The World in Wilderness, which was published in Science Fiction in 1941. An absolute bargain at just £4.99.